In finishing up this Small World series, I'll just kind of quickly recap where we've been. We started 4 weeks ago, and we talked about this idea that it's a small world, but God has a big heart. And his heart extends to the entire planet. Every language, every nation, every tongue, every culture, every ethnicity. God has a heart to see all people come to him. It's always been his heart. He's been on this big cosmic game of hide and seek. Only he's the one on the hunt, looking for people, calling them out, saying, come home. Let me show you what life's supposed to look like. And we asked that God would start to give us a heart like his, that would stretch beyond our own needs and our own impulses and our own passions to begin to reflect the passions of God as well. And then the second week, we talked about this idea that God has a big plan. He's got a way that he wants to go about transforming this world. And the plan is this: it's us. Which, if we were still in the brainstorming phase of planning, we would say, let's come up with some other ideas, don't you think? But this was God's plan. This was the opportunity he presents to every one of us who know Jesus, not just people that are in professional ministry or people that are in leadership. Every person who calls themselves a follower of Jesus is invited into this mission. And last week we talked about this idea that actually in that mission is where we find the joy that so many of us are longing for. When we go about this work that Jesus was about, showing compassion to those that are hurting, meeting real practical needs, but also doing that recognizing that they're more than just physical beings, they're spiritual as well, and bringing the hope of God's love into their lives. This big team where it isn't just us, it is our partners around the world, linking arms, where people who in their own countries, with passions for their people, with understanding into their culture, that we can come alongside to support and encourage, but allow them and their local churches to be the heroes in their communities. And it's been fun to hear stories and to talk. Well, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to wrap it up, and I want to, as practically as I can, help you see how you can be involved in this, okay? Because I just think what could happen if every one of us found a way that we individually could be involved in the broader work that's going on. So today's called The Big Need, and it's because it may be a small world, but you do not have to look very hard to discover there are a lot of needs, aren't there? There are a lot of needs. It can be even a little overwhelming. So what do we do about that? Well, to answer that question, I want to look at two stories from the New Testament. In fact, they may be some of the best known stories in all the Bible. But the first one can be found in Luke chapter 10. And if you have a Bible, I want to ask you to turn there. Luke chapter 10. We're going to start in verse 25. And by the way, if you don't have a Bible, it would make my day to meet me over here after the service. Come over, and I'd love to give you a Bible, okay? I'll even help you see kind of where to start reading it, because sometimes that can be a little overwhelming for people. The Bible's actually 66 books in one. Where do you start? And so we want to help. And so you can stop down. I'd love to talk to you more about that. But if you do have a Bible or on your app or whatever, Luke chapter 10, verse 25. And as you get there, you already see, I think I know this story, because most people do. In fact, if you grabbed somebody on the street and said, hey, you may not know much about Jesus, but can you name one story or something that he taught? Odds are this is probably what he'll talk about. It's the Good Samaritan. It's a story that transcends any individual religion. It's acknowledged as one of the great stories of all time of what it means to be aware of needs around us. But it's one of the parables of Jesus. And of course, a parable is simply this amazing teaching technique that Jesus would take profound lessons, like mind-blowing kinds of lessons, and he would distill them down into these apparently innocent stories that anybody could understand. He does about 40 parables over the course of his ministry. And so what we're going to actually be doing is starting next week, we're doing a series through the whole summer on the parables of Jesus. It's called The Greatest Stories Ever Told. And we're going to be looking at these amazing little stories that we can all relate to and understand, but that will blow our minds if we let them. And so whether you are new to all this or maybe interested in Jesus or have friends who are interested in Jesus but aren't sure about all the religion stuff, or if when you picture Jesus, you picture just some sort of hippie who's like throwing flowers, skipping through a field or something, when you actually look at what he had to say, you discover that is not the case. These stories are challenging. And they weren't just challenging in his day, they're challenging in our day as well. So I'm very excited about this series. I hope you're planning to be here. We'll kick it off next week. But anyway, this is one of those parables, and probably the best known. So I'm going to just read, even if this is familiar to you, just follow along and let's kind of pull some of the goodies out of this. Here we go. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. So he's got an agenda, obviously, already. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself." Verse 28, "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." So he starts off with a question that everybody wrestles with at one time or another. In fact, a question that we just finished talking about in a series we did called Afterlife. What is this whole eternal life thing? How can I understand? But pretty soon, we realize he's more than just personally curious. There's an agenda behind the scenes here. He's got a motive. And so look at what verse 29 tells us about what's happening in this guy's heart. But he, this teacher, he says he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Who is my neighbor? I mean, I know there's a lot of people around, but who exactly is my neighbor? And this is one of the challenges that it seems to me is before us as we talk about the kinds of things that we've been looking at in this series. There's this temptation to actually sort of do the same thing this guy did, to feel the same way, because we hear about issues on the other side of the world and we think to ourselves, we've got enough problems in our own country right now. We got enough issues in our own communities right now. Maybe we don't just focus on fixing them, and then we can worry about all that stuff on the other side of the globe later. And that's all true, of course. We certainly have our challenges. You don't have to watch the news very long to figure that out. Which is why we do so many things to address those needs here in our own community. Whether it's partnering with local organizations or other churches to try to serve in different ways, working with all sorts of nonprofits to meet needs throughout our community. We offer ministries to try to address basic kinds of things like marriages that are struggling or people that are trapped in addictions. Every year we give away hundreds of thousands of dollars to people in crisis, both within our church family and in the broader community around here as well. There's no doubt those are our neighbors, and they've got plenty of needs. But the reason that we chose this title, "It's a Small World," is because it really is, isn't it? I mean, through communication and technology, we have opportunities to engage in parts of the world that previous generations never even heard of, let alone dreamed of ever going to. In fact, after last service, I walked off stage, pulled out my phone because it was buzzing. It was my friend in India who was just texting me to let me know how their Sunday had gone. What kind of world do we live in? He's just sending me pictures of his church. Who is my neighbor? Friends, we can't see not only the needs in our area and the needs around the world and try to justify ourselves, let ourselves off the hook. Who is our neighbor? Well, Jesus answers his question, and you know what he says. Verse 30, in reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho." I've been on this road. It's very rugged terrain, very steep hills, very dangerous environment, rough. Just as it was then, it is still today. Well, a man goes down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and when he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, a member of sort of an important family, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. When a Samaritan, as he traveled, came, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, which would have been standard medical care in that time. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, Go and do likewise. I mean, you've heard the story before. It's just such an elegant, beautiful thing. Sometimes I wonder if Jesus had this stuff like in the ready. Like, had he written this? Like, when did he write this? This is so good. You know what I mean? Is he just winging it? That's amazing. Anyway. And when you look at that story, I'm sure the priest, the Levite, these are busy guys. They've got responsibilities. They may have had legitimate reasons that they passed by on the other side of the road. Many people talk about that when they talk about this passage. But that's really not the point. According to Jesus, whatever it was they had to focus on didn't really matter because they came across a need. And friends, as we talk about these needs, we freely acknowledge none of us in this room is bored. Maybe a little bored, but we're not laying around with all kinds of spare time on our hands. We have pressures and stresses and problems and mortgage payments and medical bills and college savings plans we're behind on or retirement plans we're behind on. We all have these kinds of pressures in our life. And it's interesting, the hero in this story is not a guy with all kinds of free time on his hand, is it? Because what's it say? He can't even stick around at the inn once he drops the guy off for help. He has to keep going. He's got something to do. But he leaves money behind to take care of the need, right? It's not a man with spare time on his hands, not a vacation, leisurely life. No, he's busy, but he recognizes a need, and he sees that need as more important than the busyness in his life. And the hero of this story isn't some religiously pious person or a person from the right religious family or with the most impressive job. The hero is actually the least spiritually respected person in the story. Most of you know Samaritans were considered spiritually and culturally inferior. In fact, most of the listeners in Jesus' day probably would have preferred to have been the person beaten up by the side of the road than to be the Samaritan. That's how deep the racial discrimination was in that culture. And Jesus is taking it head on in this scene. And of course, Jesus' main point here is that what matters more than your perfect doctrine or your spiritual standing is whether those things actually translate into the things you do, into showing compassion when you see a need. That doesn't mean those things aren't important. Of course they're important. It just means they're no substitute for the simple act of being open-handed and open-hearted. Who is our neighbor? Well, for the Good Samaritan, it's the person in front of him who had needs. And friends, in our small world, we have neighbors in Kirkland and Kathmandu, Bothell and Bangalore, Everett, Ethiopia, Kenmore in Kabul, Bellevue in Beirut, Redmond in Rajasthan, Seattle in Sri Lanka. I could do this all day. We got municipality after municipality, all right? The point is, these are our neighbors, friends. And we start with the need in front of us. There's so many things I love about living up in this area, but one of them is the diversity culturally, ethnically, that's around here. I remember when we first moved here 6 years ago, our youngest, who we adopted internationally, she's not the same ethnicity as us. Anyway, when we first got here, even as a little girl, I remember her commenting on how she noticed there were a lot of people who looked different around here. Even a little kid noticed that. Well, our house is right at the end of the neighborhood on the street there, and so we're right next to the bus stop where the kids get picked up every morning, and more than half of the kids at the bus stop outside our house are of different ethnicities. Many of them are kids of first-generation folks who've come over and immigrated to the United States for work or whatever reason. It is a small world. It's a crazy small world. And we have the chance to meet people and reach people from around the world, not only by getting on an airplane, but by walking to the mailbox, or showing up at work. It's a great, incredible story, but I once heard a slightly different twist on this story that stuck with me. It was actually a sermon that I heard from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., recording. Actually, I read this section of it. Dr. King, of course, is best known for his work confronting the social injustices of the 1960s here in the United States. But first and foremost, sometimes people forget this, Dr. King was a pastor. And he preached thousands of sermons over the course of his ministry. Many of them are recorded. We have his notes. It's fascinating to study. And one of the passages that he very often returned to when he spoke was the Good Samaritan. In fact, the sermon the night before he was assassinated was based on the passage around the Good Samaritan, the same one that I just read. But as he was talking about this, he would sometimes put a slightly different spin on it. He, of course, acknowledged that the main point of this story was that we are called to help our neighbor regardless of what racial issues may be involved, no matter who they are or what threats they may be facing. And he challenged people, rightly so, to do that. But he made another very interesting observation I had never thought of before. Really not Jesus' main point, but still insightful. Here's what he says. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. But that will only be an initial act. One day, the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. He's saying, yes, meet that immediate need before you, but also step back and begin to ask yourself, are there systems, are there things that need addressed, that need fixed, that may actually lead to a better day for anyone who travels down the Jericho road? Help the man by the side of the road, but figure out how to make it safe to travel the Jericho road. Maybe organize a neighborhood patrol or just at least put up some lights or something, right? The point is, do more than just meet needs. Figure out how to fix problems. Figure out ways to improve systems or situations and do it in a sustainable way that doesn't depend on you. See, I think that's at the center of so many of our partnerships. We mentioned some of them these last few weeks, but let me highlight a few more. For example, Nicaragua. Many of you are probably familiar if you've been around North Shore any period of time. For the last decade plus, we've had an incredible partnership there in Nicaragua. For those who are a little rusty on their Central American geography, just to the north, of course, is Honduras, Guatemala. Then you get up into Mexico. To the south, you have Costa Rica. Below that, Panama. And we've helped meet immediate needs in that community through feeding programs and different sorts of things like that. But we wanted to figure out long-term solutions to the issues there in that area. And that's why at the center of our partnership, right there in Nicaragua, is work with a school designed to help kids who have been raised in poverty learn the skills that they need to actually be able to do something different in their life, to break out of those systems and cycles of poverty, support their families, change their family trees. And it's associated with the church outside the capital city of Managua. And so North Shore funded and largely constructed a school. And we still, to this day, support many of the teachers as well as many of the students who are not only hearing about Jesus, but who are also getting an excellent education so that they will be able to build their community, make the road in Jericho safe. And these are some of those faces. I visited this beautiful place. Incredible work going on there, continuing to make an impact in that country. And on top of that, we've partnered with that same local church to plant 4 additional churches in the surrounding communities in that region. We're doing the same thing in the Philippines. You heard Brian earlier talk a bit about the work happening in Bohol. And again, for those of us who are a little rusty on our geography, that little collection of orange dots in the middle of the page there, that's the Philippines. And to the northwest is China. Directly to the west, we have Vietnam. But if you zoom in just a bit, you'll see the Philippines is actually a collection of islands. There are 7,000 islands in the nation of the Philippines. And some of them are inhabited, some of them aren't. But with them being so spread out like that, some of them are very remote and in places very primitive. And so our partnerships are on 2 of these islands, a place called Negros and a place called Bohol. And these are incredibly remote places. But we're not only helping plant churches and telling people about Jesus, we're also doing things like economic development work, training them in sustainable farming practices, raising livestock so that they can begin to sustain and support themselves instead of being dependent on outside help, so that they can support their families in their communities. In fact, later this month, there's a team of teenagers, students from North Shore and several other churches in the area who are leaving for the Philippines later this month. I mean, think about this for a second. Here's a group of teenagers who could be doing any number of things with their summer, right? But they are giving part of it to help these people in these very remote places. working with kids, supporting the people there. Now, I don't know how you spent your summers as a teenager, but imagine the impact that this will have, not only on the folks that they're going to serve, but imagine the impression that's going to make in their hearts and in their lives. To maybe come back with a little deeper appreciation of the opportunities that we have in our country and that sit before them. Life-changing kind of stuff. Some members of that team, in fact, are going to be hanging out in the World Cafe, which will be just down the corridor out here. They're going to be serving some beans and rice, some from Nicaragua, some from the Philippines, so you can taste the different flavors. And you can talk with them about what their trip's going to involve and find out how maybe you can be praying or supporting them through that experience. See, this idea, as we talked about last week, that Jesus came, he was mighty in word and deed. We want to make sure we're doing both of those well. Bringing good news that new life is possible through Jesus, but also meeting practical needs because God cares about their physical lives as well. We're wrestling with how in the world do we talk about all these different partnerships, because we could do a whole year worth of series telling stories. But let me just in summary highlight some of the others that we have. There's work going on in Haiti with a feeding program and orphan care going on in conjunction with the church outside Port-au-Prince, the capital city. In Peru, in South America, we work with Helping Hands, which is a local thrift shop where you can donate stuff, and the proceeds of that stuff's sales goes to support work there in Peru. One of the things that they do is a place called the Oasis Center, where they're teaching women to be seamstresses and tailors, to make clothing and do garment repair and so forth, so that they too can develop a better life for them and their families. Work going on in southern Spain, addressing the massive issue of human trafficking. Statistic I got this week, 27 million people around the world currently sexually enslaved. Crazy. 2 million of them kids. And that's happening in places like southern Spain, many places. So we're sending teams to try to help some of those people stuck in that world, but we're also going because many of those girls are migrating into Europe from Nigeria. Many of the people in Nigeria feel like they'll have a better chance at life if they go into Europe, not realizing that they're sending them into this system where many of them are lured in and ensnared to do work they never would dream of doing. And so we're sending partners to Nigeria to educate those families, to teach their pastors and other leaders in their communities. When you're sending them, here's how to equip them for that journey. Here's what they need to watch out for. Here's how they can keep inadvertently being enslaved. We're trying to solve problems, not just meet immediate needs. Be smart about this. I could tell you about the work happening in Papua New Guinea, or the work of Ryan and Kate Chisholm, who also, like some others we've met, Ryan actually grew up right here at North Shore, but they serve right now in a Middle Eastern country so close to Christian work that we don't talk about where they are or even what they're doing for their own protection. I could tell you about Bob and Jane Sturm in Ethiopia, or their daughter Amy and her husband Ken in Mozambique, or Trent and Marie Burke, who support other ministry partners in Southeast Asia. We have unique partnerships here in the United States. One of them is to international students who flock to our incredible universities around here. A great ministry called Talk Time, led by Liz and Paul Godwin, who work with international students, teaching them English by helping them read the Bible. Or a woman named Marcia Gladwish, who's using her art and storytelling to help women both locally and internationally find God in their stories. We have partners in Austria, a couple named Gordy and Tabitha Beck. Again, Gordy spent some time here at North Shore, and they're working specifically with the refugees that are flooding into Europe. And I know when you say refugee, all kinds of controversy stirs up, right? Political hot potato with all sorts of opinions. And we can debate the politics of how we respond to refugees. Everybody agrees we have to be wise about how we handle that. But part of the challenge of this series is to begin to look at the issues of our world through God's eyes, from a spiritual perspective. So think about this for just a second. Hundreds of thousands of people are leaving countries where it is illegal to talk about Jesus. They're fleeing situations where they could be executed simply for being Christians. And they're coming into other environments where people can serve and talk openly in Jesus' name. This is one of the greatest opportunities to impact the Muslim world that has ever been seen, largely because they're relocating out of those regions. Now again, the politics of it, debate that with someone else. I'm not interested. I'm excited to see the opportunity in Jesus' name to touch lives for him, to meet needs. And so Gordy and Tabitha specifically, they are fluent in Farsi, which is the main language in Iran and Afghanistan. And so they're working with a Farsi-speaking church there in Austria to reach those refugees and help them with resettlement, and through it all, introduce them to this Jesus who knows and loves them. I could go on, friends. You see my point? There are so many amazing things going on around this world. Why? Because there's a big need. In fact, we're barely scratching the surface. And one of the things that I've wrestled with over this last month has been this sort of frustration, like, God, with so many things, with so many needs, it's overwhelming. I mean, how can we, this sort of medium-sized church in the suburbs of Seattle, how in the world can you expect us to do something about this stuff? I mean, it's paralyzing to think about the number of people without safe water, the number of people without basic nutritional needs, the number of people with no access to basic health care, the number of people without shelter or enslaved sexually. And that's not even to mention all the spiritual needs that are out there. Millions of people who have never met a Christian, never heard the name Jesus, no such thing as a Bible in their language. It is enough to leave you overwhelmed, just bolted to your seat, paralyzed from the load. But in those moments, it is worth remembering the other quick story I want to remind you of. A story when the disciples were feeling the exact same way, overwhelmed by the need before them, totally powerless. Do you remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000? It's one of the best known of all. Jesus had been teaching for a long time, if you remember how the story sets up, and the people are hungry. So the disciples go to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, if you talk much longer, we're going to have to feed these people. All right? They're getting hungry. We don't know what we're going to do. So why don't you send them home to get their own lunch? And Jesus doesn't want them to miss out on this opportunity. So he says, no, here's what I want. You guys feed them, he says. And what you're going to love about the disciples, if you spend any time reading the New Testament, it's so generous of the disciples to try to straighten Jesus out. They do this quite regularly. Like, Jesus, here he goes again. We got to straighten him out. Poor guy. Just a carpenter kid, I guess. What are you going to do? But anyway, Jesus, you don't understand. If we would love to feed him, that'd be awesome. It would take 6 months' worth of wages to feed all these people, Jesus. We would love it. But we just didn't happen to bring all our cash with us today, all right? Hadn't stopped by the ATM. So back to you, Jesus. You know, that kind of thing. And you'll notice there was nothing unclear about what Jesus told them to do. He simply said, feed them. But they looked at their own meager resources and they thought, he can't mean us. He can't mean us. What does Jesus say in response? Pretty interesting. He simply asks, well, what do you have? What do you have? Well, because they don't have nothing. You remember the story. They have to scrounge around a little bit. What do they come up with? They find this little boy. He brought a sack lunch that his mom packed so he could come hear Jesus talk. And they pull out that sack lunch. You remember what's in it? 5 loaves, 2 fishes. We got 5 dinner rolls and 2 sardines. Okay, here we go. And this is presented to Jesus as the collected resource from which they're going to meet this massive need, right? And this is when the Apostle Andrew enters the conversation, because apparently Andrew's got like a graduate degree from the University of Galilee or something. And he looks at these 5 dinner rolls and a couple of sardines. And at the end of this verse in John chapter 6, verse 9, he basically says, what are these among so many, he says. And honestly, that would be me. You know why? Because I went to college, right? I took a math course. My dad's an accountant. But you got 5,000 hungry people, 5 loaves and 2 fish. You do not need your CPA license to figure out that's not going to work. But what does Jesus say? What's he say? Give it to me. What do you have? Just give it to me. I can work with that. And in that moment, Jesus takes responsibility for the miracle, and he proceeds to get the job done. He feeds 5,000 people to overflowing. People are taking to-go boxes. There's so much food. And you notice, Jesus didn't ask for what was necessary. He didn't ask the disciples to do the miracle. He just asked, are you willing to give me what you have, and then let me do what I do? Miracles. And friends, I believe that same question he asked those guys on that hillside is the same question he's asking us in this room today. What do you have? Are you willing to let me use it? Last week, what some of us had was our grocery budgets. And we just swapped out meals, and instead of enjoying whatever we normally would have enjoyed, we swapped them out for rice and beans. And through that, we said, we'll take this extra that we didn't spend on our groceries and maybe even throw a little extra in, and we'll pull those resources together. It'll be a little more than 5 loaves and a couple of fish, but maybe God can do something with it. Maybe he'll build this training center where developing young church planters can go and learn the Bible and learn the skills of leadership and planting a church in a difficult environment, with the goal to raise at least $75,000 to make that happen. What do you have? What do you have? Maybe you don't have a ton of spare time, but do you have any availability at all? Do you have any resources at all? Any prayers at all that you'd be willing to just say, God, I don't even know what this will do. I mean, these needs are overwhelming, but here's my fish. You could take a look at places like our global mission website, northshore.church/global, with details about how you can get involved, the way that our work is happening around the world. You can find online our Facebook, North Shore Mission, Global Mission Facebook groups to get up-to-date information on some of our partners and prayer requests or specific needs that they sometimes have. Every week during this hour, during the 9:30 hour, there's a group that meets upstairs in one of our classrooms called Adventure in Mission. It's AIM is what it's short name. And it's a group of people who are passionate about this global work, who get together every week to update on how things are going. Very often, teams that are going out on trips will come in for prayer and then later come in to report on what they saw happen. Or they'll link up technologically with partners that we have globally to get updates directly from them in real time to hear about the stuff that's going on. Do you have some time on a Sunday morning? You could be a part of that. Many of you know we have an incredible list of short-term opportunities that you could be part of. You could go on a trip. You could meet some of those leaders that are going to be leading those trips down in the World Cafe. Because just today, there's a medical team leaving for Nepal just this afternoon. As soon as we finish third service, they're jumping in a car to drive down to SeaTac and get on the plane. The student team I mentioned leaving for the Philippines later this month. Other upcoming trips. There are multiple trips to North Africa and southern Spain to deal with some of the refugee issues there. There's trips coming up to Peru. There's several different trips going to Nicaragua. Men's trips, women's trips, couples trips, different opportunities to engage. Additional trips coming up to the Philippines. There's another trip planned for India after the first of the year. There may even be more that develop over time. But those are trips. And even if you can't go on those trips, even if you can't make that vacation time work, what would it look like to financially say, I can't go, but let me help someone go? Or to pray for them when they're there. Please pray for that Nepal team that's going to be leaving this afternoon. Way after way after way. And you don't have to know exactly what he's going to do with it. You simply have to be willing to say, here's what I have, God. Here's what I have, and I give it to you. It's not much, but it's yours. On your response card in your program, there's a spot where you can mark that you're interested in some of those short-term trips, and you can hear more about upcoming opportunities. There's an incredible training opportunity coming up later this year where a globally known expert in this field is coming in to do work to train us on how we can even be more effective, and you could sit in and learn. But what can you do as a family or as a small group or as an individual? What do you have, friends? What do you have? And what could happen If even with just the meager resources that you and I have in our pockets, if we put those out there and said, it's not much, God, but it's yours, what could happen? I think what we've been talking about, just the start. Well, let's ask God to move in that way. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for your generous invitation to be part of your work. Thank you for the ways that you are using this church and the partners we have to transform lives both in this life and in the life to come. Thank you for the generosity of this place and the people who sacrificially say, here's what I have, God, you use it. But Lord, I pray for our ministry partners around the world. Some in environments where they can serve and lead and reach out openly. Others in places where they have to lay low for fear of serious consequences, far beyond anything any of us are familiar with. So God, I pray, yes, that you'll protect them, but more important, that you'll make them brave, that you'll give them courage to carry out this mission that you've given them. But I not only pray that for people who speak other languages and live far away, I pray that for us. Because I believe you've given us a mission, God. It's where the joy is. And so I pray you'll make us courageous and brave at work, school, in our neighborhoods, on the streets. We thank you. I thank you for these friends, and I thank you for this church and the impact it's having. We're yours. All we got, Lord, it's yours. Use it. In Jesus' name, amen.